Your hands, Dad. Look at your hands. You cannot sit at the head table looking like you just crawled out of a concrete trench. My son, Julian, hissed these words in a panicked, breathless whisper, his fingers digging into the sleeve of my modest, off-the-rack grey suit. He was looking down at my palms, which were mapped with deep, permanent lines of grey mortar and thick, yellowed calluses. I have spent 40 years laying the literal foundations of this city, building a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio, brick by agonizing brick, yet to my only son, my hands were a social disease. We were standing in the grand ballroom of the Whispering Pines estate, a venue that practically dripped with old money opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain from the vaulted ceilings, casting a soft golden glow over hundreds of high society guests. Julian's bride, Beatrice, was across the room, surrounded by her family of judges and corporate lawyers. She glanced over at us, her eyes narrowing with a cold, aristocratic disdain before she quickly looked away. Julian noticed her look and visibly flinched. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive champagne, and whispered that my rough, bricklayer aura would ruin the wedding photos. He said Beatrice's family would be mortified to share the head table with someone who looked like hired help. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a folded piece of cardstock, and pressed it into my scarred palm. He told me he had moved me to table 42. I looked across the sprawling, gilded room, tracing the numbers until my eyes landed on table 42. It was tucked away in the furthest, darkest corner of the ballroom, positioned directly next to the heavy, swinging double doors of the kitchen. I could hear the muffled shouts of the prep cooks and the harsh, metallic clatter of dirty dishes being stacked. This was where my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose Ivy League tuition I had paid in cash, was banishing his own father. I stood there in silence, letting the weight of his betrayal settle deep into my chest. I looked at the towering, 5-foot-tall floral arrangements, the silk drapery, and the gourmet 5-course menus resting on each gold-rimmed plate. This entire lavish spectacle cost $150,000. It was a staggering sum of money, and every single penny of it had been paid for with a check signed by these very calloused hands. They loved my money, but they despised the sweat it took to earn it. They wanted the gilded cage, but they were ashamed of the builder who forged the bars. In that quiet, agonizing moment, something inside me broke, but it did not leave me shattered. The stinging pain of a wounded father evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable steel. I looked at Julian, really looked at him, and saw the hollow, ungrateful stranger he had become. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or cause a scene. I simply folded the place card, slipped it into my pocket, and looked my son in the eyes with an unshakable resolve. I told him to enjoy his beautiful evening, walked past him, and headed straight for the exit, carrying the ultimate power of retraction in my coat pocket. It is a terrible thing to realize you have spent your entire life building a pedestal for your child, only for him to use that height to look down on you with disgust. As I walked away from the glittering lights of the wedding venue, the cold weight of Julian's rejection pressed against my ribs, dragging me back to the bitter reality of where we both began. My mind drifted back 30 years to the devastating winter when my sweet wife Martha passed away. She left me with a broken heart, a fledgling masonry business, and a 3-year-old boy who depended on me for his survival. Over her fresh grave, I made a silent vow that I would give Julian the world, even if I had to tear it down and rebuild it with my bare hands. In those early years, survival was a brutal, daily negotiation with the elements. I remember the bitter winter mornings when the wind off the river felt like broken glass against my face. I would stand in mud up to my shins, mixing concrete by hand, because I could not afford a mechanical mixer. The freezing wet mixture would seep through my worn-out canvas work gloves, cracking the skin of my fingers until they bled. I used to seal those deep, stinging cuts with superglue just so I could keep laying bricks the next day. I wore boots with holes in the soles, stuffing them with cardboard to keep the freezing slush out, all so Julian could wear pristine leather shoes to his elite private academy. Every dollar I saved went straight into his tuition fund. I chose to starve my own comfort so my son could feast on opportunity. Julian was a sweet, bright boy back then. He used to wait by the window for my old truck to rattle into the driveway. He would run out, completely unbothered by the grey dust on my clothes, and throw his small arms around my neck. He used to tell his teachers with immense pride that his dad built the tallest buildings in the city. But somewhere along the line, as the private school tuition slips turned into Ivy League enrollment forms, that pride rotted into deep, festering shame. The transformation was slow, like water wearing away stone, but it was devastating. It started when Julian went to university. He began associating with the children of old money executives, politicians, and judges. Slowly, the boy who used to hug his dusty father started keeping his distance. I will never forget the day I drove up to his campus to surprise him, only to overhear him talking to his new, wealthy peers. One of them asked about his father's business, and instead of telling them I was a self-made mason who owned a growing portfolio of properties, Julian laughed nervously. He told them I was a retired real estate developer who had suffered a severe boating accident, which explained why my hands were so horribly scarred and calloused. I stood in the shadow of the brick archway, a structure I had ironically donated the funds to build, and felt a cold sweat wash over me. He had invented an entirely fictional, aristocratic lineage just to erase the sweat and grease of the man who had paved his way. I swallowed my pride that day, choosing to believe it was just a phase of youthful insecurity. I let him live his lie, quiet and complicit, because my unconditional love outweighed my wounded ego. But looking back now, as I walk away from his wedding with the venue check in my pocket, I realize that my silence did not protect him. It only nourished the monster of his arrogance. The first time Julian introduced me to Beatrice, she did not look at my face. She looked at my cuffs. We sat in a stiflingly quiet, over-decorated French restaurant downtown, the kind of place where the portions are microscopic and the snobbery is thick enough to choke on. Beatrice was a portrait of old money elegance, draped in pearls that I immediately recognized as cultured, not natural. My decades in real estate development have made me an expert in reading assets, and beneath her polished aristocratic exterior, I smelled the distinct, desperate stench of decaying wealth. Her family, once prestigious in the local legal circuit, was drowning in debt, desperately clinging to a high society lifestyle they could no longer afford. But I kept my mouth shut, letting my hands rest flat on the white tablecloth, exposing the rough skin and yellowed calluses. I chose to play the role they had already written for me, the simple, uneducated old bricklayer who had stumbled into a bit of money. It was a tactical decision. When you let people believe they are smarter than you, they become sloppy. Throughout that dinner, Beatrice and her mother spoke about me as if I were a piece of old furniture, using passive-aggressive remarks wrapped in sweet, condescending tones. They lamented the lack of refinement in modern men, casting pointed looks at my plain, off-the-rack jacket. Julian sat there, nodding eagerly, silently pleading with me not to embarrass him. I smiled warmly, ordered the cheapest draft beer on the menu, and played the fool. I watched Beatrice's calculating eyes track my every move, assessing my worth not as a future father-in-law, but as a bank ledger. It did not take long for the real demands to surface. Within 3 weeks, the wedding budget ballooned to a staggering $150,000. But that was just the price of admission. Beatrice gently explained to Julian, who then nervously explained to me, that a couple of their social standing could not possibly live in a rental. They needed a luxury penthouse downtown, a sprawling property overlooking the river, requiring a massive six-figure down payment. They expected me to simply hand over the cash, expecting the simple, doting father to blindly sign away his hard-earned wealth to secure his son's happiness. I agreed to every single demand, with a cheerful, cooperative smile. But beneath that compliant facade, my analytical mind was already erecting fortress-like safeguards. I did not write a single check to Julian or Beatrice. Instead, I insisted on paying the wedding vendors directly, mailing personal checks signed by my own hand to the caterers, the florists, and the venue. When it came to the luxury penthouse, I paid the down payment, but I quietly structured the purchase through one of my holding companies, keeping my name solely on the property deed. Julian and Beatrice believed they were clever, whispering in corners about how easy I was to manipulate, completely unaware that they were walking into a legal cage of my own design. I documented every text message, every inflated invoice, and every condescending email they sent. It was a cold, heartbreaking realization. My son did not want his father at his wedding. He wanted a transaction. And as I quietly filed away the deeds and receipts, I knew that this transaction was about to be cancelled. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a man when he realizes he has nurtured his own executioner. I stood in the dimly lit carpeted hallway of the Whispering Pines private suite, holding Beatrice's forgotten white leather wedding planner in my hands. The rehearsal dinner downstairs had just wrapped up, and I had noticed she left her precious book on the table. Thinking only of saving her from a moment of panic, I had walked up the stairs to return it. But the door to the bridal suite was ajar, and the words drifting through the gap stopped me cold, turning the blood in my veins to liquid nitrogen. It was Beatrice's voice, sharp and mocking, completely stripped of the sweet, fragile veneer she usually wore in my presence. She said that she could not bear the thought of having my rough, scarred hands in the official wedding album, and that she had already instructed the photographer to crop me out of any group shots. I heard a soft, aristocratic chuckle, followed by the dry, snobbish voice of her mother. Her mother murmured that it was a small price to pay to secure the keys to the downtown penthouse. She told Beatrice to just play along for a few more days until the final deed transfer was officially recorded. Then, the heaviest blow fell. It came from my own son. Julian laughed, a hollow, sycophantic sound that broke whatever lingering warmth I had left for him in my heart. He said that once the penthouse was in their names, they would have no more use for the embarrassing old cement mixer. He actually used those words. He told them he had already researched a state-run care facility on the outskirts of the county, a cheap, depressing place where they could quietly commit me under the guise of age-related cognitive decline. He said it would keep me out of their social circles permanently, ensuring I wouldn't ruin their dinners with my blue-collar stories and cheap suits. Outside the grand estate, the sky opened up. Rain began to beat heavily against the leaded glass windows, and a low, rolling rumble of thunder shook the very foundations of the building. But inside me, there was no storm. There was only a sudden, terrifying stillness. The agonizing heartbreak of a betrayed father evaporated in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a man who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing. They thought they were the apex predators, whispering in the dark, but they had forgotten a fundamental rule of construction. You never undermine the foundation of the man who built the house you are standing in. I looked down at the leather planner in my hands. I did not storm into the room. I did not scream or cry or demand an explanation. Angering them would only make them defensive, giving them time to scramble. Instead, my mind began to work with clinical, legal precision. I remembered the exact wording of the penthouse contract, which was safely held under my private holding company, not their names. I remembered the $150,000 venue check sitting in the manager's office, a check that would not be processed until Monday morning. I quietly set the planner down on a console table in the hallway, stepped back into the shadows of the corridor, and walked away. They had drawn up their plans for my demolition, completely unaware that I had already built the fortress that would crush them. There is a terrifying clarity that comes when you watch your only child walk down the aisle on a red carpet bought with your own blood, sweat, and calluses. The ceremony was, by all accounts, flawless. The string quartet played with effortless grace, their music floating up to the vaulted ceilings of the chapel, while the scent of white roses filled the air. I stood near the back, a quiet spectator to the fairy tale I had funded. Every detail, from the hand-engraved invitations to the silk drapes, had been paid for by my hands. Yet, as I watched Julian exchange vows with Beatrice, there was no warmth in my chest. I looked at my son, dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo, and realized I was looking at a masterpiece of my own foolish creation. I had built his pedestal so high that he could no longer see the ground he walked on, nor the man who laid the bricks. As the ceremony concluded and the guests filtered toward the grand ballroom, the atmosphere shifted to aggressive opulence. This was Beatrice's grand social exhibition. I moved with the crowd, keeping my head held high, my calloused hands resting in the pockets of my simple gray suit. I could feel the cold, dismissive glances from Beatrice's family and their wealthy associates. I was a stain on their perfect canvas, a working-class ghost haunting their aristocratic dream. I made my way toward the entrance, intending to find my designated spot, when a firm, panicked grip caught my elbow. I turned to see Julian. His face was flushed, his eyes darting anxiously around the foyer. He pulled me into a stone alcove, away from the crowd. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. He begged me to please just stay at the kitchen table, table 42, and not to wander near the front. He said Beatrice's father is a federal judge, and they could not have me talking about physical labor or masonry to their guests. He looked at me with deep embarrassment, whispering that it was just for tonight, begging me not to ruin this. I stood frozen, looking deeply into his eyes, searching for the little boy who used to wait for my dusty truck. But there was nothing. The child I had raised on sacrifice was gone, replaced by a hollow stranger consumed by vanity. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer swelled, filling the silence like a countdown. Every tick sounded like a hammer striking stone, shattering the final bond of my fatherly devotion. The stinging pain of his insult did not break me. Instead, it forged an absolute, icy resolve. I did not argue. I simply looked at my son and let a calm, chilling smile settle on my lips. I reached out, patted his shoulder, and told him to enjoy his evening. Then, I turned my back on him. I did not head toward table 42. Instead, I walked quietly toward the side doors of the foyer. Stepping out into the cool air, my hand brushed my breast pocket. Inside lay the final pending payment authorization for the $150,000 venue fee. I slid it deeper into my pocket and walked away, leaving my son to pay the true price of his betrayal. The heavy door of my truck clicked shut, cutting off the distant, muffled echoes of the wedding music and leaving me in a silence that felt clean, sharp, and absolutely final. There was no hesitation in my fingers as I pulled out my phone. The time for parental indulgence was officially over, replaced by the cold, calculating survival instinct that had built my empire from the dirt up. I dialed the direct line to my private banker, Marcus, who answered on the second ring despite the weekend hour. I told him calmly and clearly that I needed to issue an immediate, absolute stop payment order on check number 1482, the $150,000 draft written to the Whispering Pines estate. Marcus did not ask questions. He knew the weight of my voice and the authority it carried. But I was not finished. I told him to immediately revoke my co-signature on the pending luxury penthouse mortgage for Julian and Beatrice, withdrawing my holding company as the guarantor and pulling the down payment back into my primary account. With a few keystrokes on the other end of the line, the financial floor beneath my son's gilded life was completely dismantled. I hung up the phone, placed it in the cup holder, and looked at my calloused hands in the dim dashboard light, realizing they had just torn down the very pedestal I had spent decades building. Meanwhile, inside the glowing warmth of the grand ballroom, the illusion was about to shatter. The reception was at its absolute peak, with champagne flowing and Beatrice laughing with aristocratic delight as she clung to my son's arm. But the music suddenly faltered, cutting to an awkward, echoing silence as the head coordinator, accompanied by 2 security guards, marched directly toward the head table. Her face was pale, stripped of the polite deference she had shown all evening. She demanded to speak with Julian and Beatrice immediately, her voice carrying across the quieted room. She informed them that the transaction for the venue and catering had been flagged and declined, and that the bank had issued a total stop payment on the primary check. Julian's face drained of color, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He stammered, pointing at Beatrice's family, claiming there must be a mistake, and that his wealthy father-in-law would easily cover the discrepancy. Beatrice's father, the supposedly elite federal judge, stepped forward with a puffed-out chest, demanding respect and threatening legal action. But his bluff was instantly dismantled when the coordinator coldly demanded another credit card or a wire transfer on the spot to avoid shutting down the event. As the minutes ticked by, the truth began to bleed out in front of their high society guests. Beatrice's family could not even cover a fraction of the cost. Their prestigious name was nothing but a hollow shell of unpaid debts and leveraged assets. Beatrice began to scream at Julian, her voice cracking with a vicious, ugly desperation, demanding to know where his useless father was. Julian reached into his pocket, his hands shaking violently as he tried to call me. In the quiet of my truck, my phone screen lit up with his name, vibrating silently against the console. I did not answer. I simply watched the screen glow, knowing that back in the ballroom, the venue manager was already threatening to call the police for grand larceny. The dream wedding had descended into a loud, humiliating public disaster, exposing the parasites for exactly what they were. I put the truck in drive, stepped on the gas, and drove away into the quiet night, finally free of their greed. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but only a single bounce check to reveal the hollow scaffolding of a lie. In the weeks that followed that disastrous night at the Whispering Pines, the glittering illusion my son had so carefully constructed vanished like smoke. The luxury penthouse purchase fell through immediately, the sellers refusing to touch a deal tainted by public scandal. Beatrice's family, exposed as desperate debtors, retreated into the shadows of their mounting lawsuits. Their marriage, built on vanity, was already fracturing under their sudden, immense debt. And then, there was Julian. He was no longer the proud, custom-tailored groom, looking down his nose at my calloused hands. When the frantic, desperate knocking echoed through my modest home, I did not rush to answer. I stood up slowly, walked to the door, and opened it to find my son standing on the porch. He was a broken, unrecognizable version of the son I had raised. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and his arrogant posture completely collapsed. He fell to his knees, weeping, his hands clutching at my trousers like he did when he was a frightened little boy. He begged for financial salvation, crying out that creditors were ruthless, Beatrice was threatening divorce, and the shame was swallowing him alive. He pleaded with me to write just one more check, begging me to save him from absolute ruin. I looked down at him, and for the first time the urge to shield him was gone. I felt a heavy sorrow, but my resolve remained as unyielding as the granite foundations I had spent 40 years laying. I pried his trembling fingers off my clothes and made him stand. I told him I loved him too much to continue funding his self-destruction. A man who does not know the value of labor will never understand the weight of dignity. He had spent years being ashamed of my rough, scarred hands. Yet those were the very hands that had built the comfortable life he took for granted. I told him that buying his way out of this humiliation would only teach him how to be a more polished coward. He needed to feel the cold, hard earth beneath his feet so he could finally learn how to build something real. Julian stared at me, desperately asking what I had done with the money meant for his penthouse. I looked him in the eyes and told him the truth. I had taken the entire penthouse fund and donated it to establish a permanent scholarship at the local vocational institute. It was a trade school fund designed to help hard-working youth who aren't afraid of sweat and grease, who want to learn masonry, carpentry, and honest labor. His inheritance was repurposed to build the futures of those who respect the foundation of hard work. The look of utter defeat on his face was agonizing to witness, but it was a necessary medicine. I patted his shoulder one last time, told him that I hoped he would find his way back to being the boy who used to hug his dusty father, and quietly closed the door. Standing alone in my quiet living room, I finally felt a deep, absolute peace. I had built my life on solid stone, and though it had been a long, hard road, I knew my foundation would never crumble. But my son would have to learn the hard way that when you build your life on sand, you must be prepared for the tide to come in.